Welcome to this special ILEDA Learning Lab podcast. The Learning Lab is one of the ongoing professional development benefits for members of ILEDA, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association. ILEDA is an organization dedicated to advancing the law enforcement profession through the development of trainers and educators and the sharing of information, research, strategies, principles, and concepts related to effective teaching and learning. The Learning Lab currently contains over 150 interviews with ILEDA members on a wide range of topics related to advancing law enforcement training. In an effort to share the experience and knowledge of ILEDA members with everyone in the law enforcement training community, we are publicly releasing some of these interviews in a bi-weekly podcast. After listening to this interview, we encourage you to go to ILETA.org, that's ILEETA.org, and find out how you can become a part of this community of trainers dedicated to serving the heroic men and women of the law enforcement profession by investing in their professional development in order to provide the best possible training. Please enjoy this interview and feel free to contact us at info@ileta.org if you have any questions. I'm Brian Willis, the Deputy Executive Director for ILEDA and your host for the ILEDA Learning Lab. And today's interview is with Kevin Davis. And we're going to talk about critical issues around use of force facing the law enforcement profession today. Kevin Davis recently retired from the Akron, Ohio Police Department after 31 years with that agency and 39 years in law enforcement. In his last assignment, Kevin worked as a detective in the body-worn camera unit. Prior assignments included 19 years as a full-time instructor in the Training Bureau, where he was a senior firearms, tactics, and suspect control instructor. Kevin has been an active expert witness throughout the United States and Canada and currently runs KD Training and Consulting. And Kevin is the author of the best-selling book, Use of Force Investigations, A Manual for Law Enforcement. So Kevin, welcome back to the ILEDA Learning Lab.
Thank you so much, Brian, and to all our fellow ILEDA members. I'm sorry I missed those of you that did attend the 2021 conference. I got COVID less than a week out from the conference and had to cancel, but the wife and I got through it and are healthy, and I was able to retire this year on the 1st of April, so we're venturing into new territories in the training business.
Well, that's good, and we're glad to have you amongst the ranks of the retired but still active trainers that we have a number of us within the ILEDA group. Now, this is a very interesting time for our profession. I guess a lot of people refer to it as the post-George Floyd era, and we see a lot of issues around use of force, a lot of misunderstandings around use of force. You do an awful lot of expert witness work in use of force. You've written books. You teach classes on investigating use of force. What are some of the most prevalent or most critical issues that you see facing our profession right now in this area of use of force that trainers need to be paying attention to?
Well, I'll just use an analogy here, Brian. Take your best shooters and take them out to the range, put them in front of a target. Let's say, make it fairly easy at 21 feet. Blindfold them, spin them around so they're unsure of the direction in which they're going to shoot, and then blow a whistle and see what happens. Tragedy will unfold, we both know, and they certainly won't hit the target, and if they do, it'll be based strictly on luck and not based on knowledge, skill, or ability. And it seems like that's what we've done to our police officers nowadays. We have moved the goal. We have moved the target. We don't tell them what they can and can't do or the means to get there until after an event is over with, and then they wonder why, A, we have depolicing going on in the United States that has resulted in, B, serious uptick in violent crime, and C, officers who are leaving the job, whether through early retirement or through greener pastures, whether they're leaving the urban agencies and going to the suburbs or just leaving law enforcement completely. So, I mean, it has gotten that bad. Little did I realize back in 2012 when I first wrote my book, Use of Force Investigations, when I commented that we were coming to the time when agencies would rather charge an officer and make him prove his innocence than vindicate him in a professional investigation. Little did I realize how true and how worse that would get. But here we are in 2021.
So it seems to me that education is a huge component of what we need to do. Educating people at the upper levels of the organization, educating people that do use of force investigations, educating those in political positions, educating the public. But it seems that we perhaps need to also do a better job of educating officers so that they can advocate for themselves, even if no one else is in place to do that for them. Is that part of this?
Oh yeah, and you've left out a couple of stakeholders that are vital to this whole conversation, and that is the legal aspect. I think we would most officers who haven't been around these events, and we're specifically talking about officer-involved shootings or in custody death or serious use of force incidents, but it applies across the board. And those other stakeholders are the legal stakeholders, whether it's the local DA or prosecutor or the law department from that agency, and also the police associations or unions involved. All of these people are part of this process. And Brian, what I have stopped thinking about anymore is policy and procedure as the driver of our response to these events, because policy and procedure, where we have something like 18,000 police agencies within the United States, and it seems like each one of them has a different take on policy and procedure in terms of use of force. And at the center of that, or the basis, may be the legal aspects, i.e. Graham v. Connor, but these policies and procedures are not where they need to be. Oftentimes they're dated, and the stakeholders haven't met or haven't received any training. And so I get away from focusing on policy and procedure nowadays and focus on developing a system. And, these are things that have to be done prior to an event. You can't wait for an event and then, go to your policy and procedure, because I guarantee you that things have changed since you wrote it. But a system is constantly updated and identifies, as we said, all the stakeholders that are involved, ensures that those people and those groups are properly trained, as you said. So it's not just, admin supervisors doing frontline investigations, or even, the ground pounders, the men and women that are on patrol, or the detective bureau that need to be trained. You also have to train your DAs, your prosecutors, and get your unions involved, including the legal representation working with the unions.
So talk a little bit more about developing a system. Systems thinking and systems theory is something that I've started to become interested in. Systems around investigating human error based on the work of Paul Taylor and some discussions I've had with Paul Taylor. And so talk about developing a system around this, and what are some of the key elements of that you see that we need to be looking at from a professional standpoint?
Well, a systemic approach to a problem or an area of concern is simply an organized framework or a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism. And we need to understand that oftentimes there becomes friction between the different groups represented in the system when there's not a pre-planned response. And, this goes back to my tactical background, with the Akron Police Department SWAT team, where we brought in mission briefing and planning years ago, where there was a formal structure for how to conduct the planning for an operation. From the time that, say, the Narcotics Bureau came to the SWAT team and said, hey, we want to conduct a search warrant on Friday at 5 a.m., there were things that had to fall into place. And what's important about that is that it doesn't rely on guesswork. It doesn't rely on just winging it. And that is one of the drivers of why I wrote the book, Use of Force Investigations, as well, because what I saw, for instance, in officer-involved shootings, is that officers were treated poorly, and the response was the investigative response and the administrative response were poor because it wasn't thought out. It was not pre-planned. So the whole idea of a system is to get, as we said, all your stakeholders involved and ensure that everybody that's involved in it has the proper training, and that can include doing run-throughs or drills in which these things are practiced. And it's even nowadays, when all the training that I did with my former agency, we recently had an event where a lot of that was thrown out. Why? Because the politics of force introduced themselves and applied friction on the police department and their response. So we have to look at the political issues involved as well. So a systems approach is more than just, it can't be, you could have, say, one or two people, say your primary investigators are well-trained. They've been to Force Science 5-day analyst school. They've been to other officer-involved shootings. They have experience with shootings in general and have investigated officer-involved shootings before. But if those people are in a system that is flawed because it's political or flawed because it's an ad hoc system, then things are going to go south in a hurry. And we see that, by the way, in my state, in Ohio. The city of Columbus is having some serious problems. You've got an excellent police organization there. You have one of their primary investigators for officer-involved shootings was a detective who probably, at least according to people I've talked to, are one of the most experienced, if not the most experienced detective doing officer-involved shootings. And, the politics of the city of Columbus introduced themselves and made it very difficult for the Columbus Police Department to do their job, to the point where they now, because of politics, have an outside agency coming in to do all OIS investigations.
And I mean that we see that political monster raising its head in so many places. Now, you talked about the importance of creating proper training within the system, and I think we can build these systems, and then at least people are better prepared when something happens. But it seems to me that part of the problem is we make assumptions about the knowledge level that people have of use of force law, of use of force policy and procedure, of human factors. We make assumptions about the knowledge level that the officers have. We make assumptions about the knowledge level of the investigators. And in a lot of cases, our assumptions are flat out wrong about people's understanding and knowledge level. Is that part of this, is to step away from making those assumptions and actually find out what people actually do know and then strive to fill that gap?
Yes, you're spot on. I mean, one of my former associates, I should say, was a very experienced lieutenant that worked a homicide unit who had investigated multiple officer-involved shootings. He was very well trained. He had been to Force Science, shooting incident reconstruction schools, was familiar with cognitive interviewing, had done it before, had a very good method or manner in which he conducted his officer-involved interviews. And what I was pushing for, and what I would push for, is a fit team approach, where you have a team of people that have received specialty training, and in order to be the primary on these investigations, they have to go through some type of apprentice program underneath or under an experienced investigator before they ever handle one by themselves. But unfortunately, one of the bosses said, any one of my detectives can handle a police shooting. And Brian, as we know, that's simply not true. There are so many different factors involved, and they don't even want to send these investigators to advanced training. I'll give you an example, and it's a sad one. And you realize this, or have heard it, I'm sure. In the state of Ohio, the Ohio Attorney General disbanded or closed the Ohio Peace Officers Training Academy in London, Ohio, and as well as there were some satellite training facilities. Essentially, all advanced training last year was abolished in the state of Ohio. All of the instructors were their jobs were eliminated, and so you had no place for anybody to go for advanced training in the middle of a time when the focus of the world is on police use of force, especially officer-involved shootings. You do that. So then the same Attorney General decides that, we're going to create task forces because they don't have the personnel within the Bureau of Criminal Investigation to investigate all OIS incidents in the state of Ohio, so they're going to do task forces. So I was involved or asked to be part of a subject matter expert group to come up with training standards for these task force members. So I thought about it and wrote out my list. It was about 7 weeks of training and about, I don't know how many thousands of dollars for these investigators, these task force members, to receive let's say, a basic foundation for doing this type of work before they even did investigation. And the result of that was that they did a 40-hour in-house training program that had never been taught before. So that gives you an idea of how not to do things. But, and these are things that I'm sure you're as flummoxed as I am about, because once again, in this day and age, when this is the most important thing, when one incident can create utter chaos and catastrophe for a city or county, why you would do something like that. As a state of Ohio and an attorney general, why would you do something like that? And the reality is there's no good answer for it. Maybe it's a financial thing. We both know that the funds have not been added. They've been in this defund the police era. These funds are not there to send people out to training or to bring trainers in, and that's a sad reality of things.
So do we need to do a better job of putting together a business case to address the financial impact of failing to properly train our officers and our investigators? It seems to me that a lot of times we're making the case that, hey, this is the right thing to do to look after our people. And other people are saying, well, you know what, we can't afford a 7-week course and it's going to cost thousands of dollars, Kevin. And do you realize the impact of that? But one night of rioting in a city over an incident or one major lawsuit will dwarf what it costs to train people. Is that a piece of it that we need to do a better job of making those in decision-making positions, the stakeholders, better aware of the cost of failing to do this training?
I don't know, Brian, because you and I have both been around long enough to have gone through the era when the driving force with police training was civil liability. In other words, agencies would only conduct training because they were afraid that they would lose millions in a civil suit. Even then, I don't think they rose to the challenge or did the training. Majority of police agencies in the state of Ohio are small agencies, and outside of annual firearms qualification, there's simply no training that's done. And so you have these agencies and you have these cities, and everybody is the ostrich. They stick their head in the sand, hoping that it's not going to happen here. Or they line up in terms of an officer-involved shooting. They say, well, we'll just bring in an outside agency, and they wipe their hands of it. And even that is seriously naive in terms of a shooting incident, because the reality is, Brian, is that if it's your officer and your agency, you cannot wipe your hands or walk away from it without involvement. And so there's so many parts. So I would say that liability didn't drive this train. I don't know that that the threat of riots or insurrections or whatever is enough to motivate police training. What I see is the politics are tremendous. Everybody's talking about police training, but unfortunately they're talking about those training programs which have research has shown had a little impact on officer decision making on the street. When we talk about, and I'm not putting down de-escalation training, I'm not putting down any training or implicit bias training, but the reality is that both of those training programs have been pretty well studied by criminal justice professionals and found that they have a negligible impact on police use of force. So you and I both know that members of ILEADA know the type of training that does make an impact, and those are the things that are not being funded.
Absolutely, and a very good point. And I think there's two issues. I think the training that officers will go to on their own is the sexy running, gunning, and kicking down doors and shooting classes, and the ones that are being pushed by the politicians are the tick-the-box courses that, as you say, the research shows that the way that they're being taught is very ineffective and a waste of time and money. And what we're not doing training on is that decision-making piece, which is so critical. So let's go back to the systems. If you were going to, if an agency came to you and said, we want to bring you in to help us build a system around this, what are some of the key elements that would be part of that systems approach?
Well, in terms of use of force investigations, and by the way, I think, you left out a part when talking about the run and gun stuff. What agencies also don't do well at is leadership. And that's one of your fortes. Mine may be a leadership and a use of force investigation. But, the realities is this improper focus by police leadership within the United States right now, that they're more worried about protecting themselves and their careers than they are the men and women in law enforcement. And this improper focus is resulting in a lot of the PC training, the PC policies and procedures. My God, we even have some agencies in the United States, or at least one that I'm aware of, that's now focusing on shooting to wound versus shooting to stop. And, that flies in the face of I don't know how many years of realistic and relevant firearms training that's gone on. But an agency, first of all, to get back to your question, an agency has to identify who the stakeholders are and find out in their pre-planning who's going to investigate, how that will be delegated, who will command, and the legal oversight that's going on, as well as other people, as we said, the police labor organizations or associations, and even people that like your officer mental health support. How will the officer, or what will the officer go through in a post-shooting debrief or something like that nature? All those people have to be involved in this. And I hate to say a committee, because you and I have been involved in ad nauseum committees where little to nothing gets done. It's reminding me of all that reimagining policing, where these people get together and blather ad nauseum and nothing ever gets accomplished. But the stakeholders in these things have to be identified, and then everyone has to be trained to the same level. And that is, going to bring, so that when I sit down and I talk as an investigator about human factors and the importance of looking at the officer as a human being and his psychological and physiological responses to stress, I don't have these blank stares across the table from someone in the city law department or commander in the police agency. I mean, everybody has to understand that how these things flow. So much of what we see nowadays in terms of use of force investigations have turned into these gone south things where you're commingling all these different investigations, and that has to be thought out. What post incident, what type of investigations are we going to do? Are we going to do a criminal investigation, and at the same time, parallel with that, do an internal investigation? Are we going to wait until the criminal is done until we do the internal? Are we going to do a tactical investigation at the same time, or is that going to be done? Because I can tell you right now, as an expert, when I go into an agency, what I see most frequently when I defend a police officer who's been charged with, let's say, a manslaughter and a police shooting, I see that they're commingling the internal. In other words, this is what policy said, this is what he didn't do, or tactical. If he would have, could have, or should have done something else, it never would have happened. And that subjects the officer to, once again, these are not legal standards. So everybody, and that would include your we talked about stakeholders, about your training bureau personnel who may not have been to some of the schools that you and I have been to, or maybe are not members of ILEADA. With you and I talked before we started the interview about Derek Chauvin and how, some of the things, i.e. Positional asphyxia, in custody death, excited delirium, all these things that you and I and the members of ILEADA are familiar with because we attend the conference and we read on this stuff and study. Some of our fellow trainers nationwide don't know about it, or our investigators. How can you have an agency where there's that, you got somebody in training, and I speak from experience here, somebody in training that has a knowledge base that goes back, to more than 25 years on police use of force, but yet you don't tap that resource in an investigation because of ego. And so that's another thing that'll ruin a system and ruin an investigation is the impact of ego.
So is part of this to start with the training cadre and make sure that our trainers have the training that they need so that they can start to roll this out? So if somebody said to you, okay, I agree that there's all these critical elements, where do we start? Do we start with the trainers to make sure that they have the knowledge that they need and then start to work in all directions from them, or is there somewhere else that we need to start?
Well, I think once you have identified who's involved in your system, it doesn't have to be one or two people that go to all the schools. But the important thing is that they come back and they share the knowledge that they've received, or share the training with others, so to bring everybody up. And that's a good way to do things. But certainly, an old saying, and you're well aware of this, is those who teach learn. So that when you send an investigator to outside of his normal comfort zone to a use of force investigation school, or rather to a use of force school, legal aspects, then when he has to come back knowing that he has to teach, he's going to be more diligent as note taking, etc., and then come back and share that information with everybody to bring everybody up. To the same level. And I think the training bureau is in a good position to do that. But oftentimes, your investigators, some of the stuff like sending them to a force science analyst school can increase their abilities, not just in officer-involved shooting or use of force investigations, but also in their overall job. I mean, learning cognitive interviewing is going to benefit every investigator versus adversarial or where you're trying to interrogate versus interview. So, it can be, the training can be done a couple of different ways. Bring in a trainer like yourself or myself that focuses on an area and can train everybody that's involved in your system, or send a couple people out and then have those people come back and present that training to the other members of the system. So either one.
Excellent and great explanation. Now, if we're going to send people out, it strikes me that the selection of those people is critical, and then creating the expectation. So selecting people that are going to be open-minded, willing to learn, going to put the effort in during the program, going to put the effort in to put together the training that they bring back, and then put the effort in to share what they know, and then creating those expectations that's the expectation, that we're going to make this investment in you, and then what we need you to do is bring it back and share the key points. Is that part of it, that we just sometimes select people for the inappropriate reasons, and as a result don't get that return on investment when we send people to some of this training?
Either that, Brian, or we select people who are golfers who can find multiple different courses in the city that they're, hey, what time is class over with? We got to tee off at 4 p.m., So yes, or somebody that, hey, I'm going to go party for 5 days. And there has to be a better way. If we're going to improve these systems, there has to be a better way to select those members who, once again, put their ego aside, focus on the mission of the system, or their mission involved within the system, and then, screen out the people that are there for personal aggrandizement or to build their, vitae, and to focus on people that are really doing it, out of an altruistic goal.
So is part of that screening process to lay out the expectations? Because a lot of people, if you say, hey, we're gonna send you to this place, and it might be a pretty nice place, they would never send us to nice places, but they would send us to crappy places in the middle of winter. But is that part of it, to lay out the expectation? We're going to send you here, but here's the expectations of you while you're there and when you come back. Because is that part of this, where some of those people are going to self-select out, say, you know what, I'd love to go there for 5 days, but I ain't doing all that work, so send somebody else? Is that part of it? If we let people know the expectations up front, then we might be better able to get the people that are going to be truly invested in this?
Oh, yeah. Since I retired, I've been in contact with one of my former partners in the unit. He's a great guy, but I really advanced my knowledge and advanced the police department's ability to deal with digital video evidence. And a lot of that was my own personal expense and time spent going to training programs, because at that time the agency was not going to send me, or was not going to send anybody. And I said to my former partner, that he should go to these types of courses, and he was completely uninterested. He said, no, that's not really the goal, or that's not really the mission of the unit. We're dealing with body-worn cameras. We're not dealing with, murders or officer-involved shootings. And so he was disinterested in attending any advanced training. So what they did is they wrote and it was amazing to me to hear that on the new bid, when they put these training, the person selected for this position will have to go to these schools. How many people didn't apply? Veteran officers who would have been good at it. They were tech savvy, for instance, but they were not interested in going to schools. So I think you're spot on there. But, it's just like everything else. When we talk about a specialty assignment or a specialty position, like let's say accident reconstructionist, that's a tremendous amount of training and experience necessary to become an expert in accident reconstruction. And some people, will go to a few schools and bid out, won't want to do it anymore. We have those kind of guys in law enforcement. But I think some of these jobs should have a commitment. For instance, if you're going to be a part of a FIT team, a force investigation team, or respond or be a part of these systems we've talked about, then you should commit to a certain amount of time in that position before you can, opt out or bid out to another position. I think that's very important.
And money, we talked about budgets are always getting cut. Money is always an issue. Now, you talked about one of the options is hosting training. It seems that we sometimes don't maximize that enough, and sometimes people would rather get the road trip than the training. But I know years ago I did a class for an agency out on the East Coast, small department, 8.5 officers, so they had one half-time position. But their chief was an ILEADA member, and in the 10 years he'd been the chief, he tapped into $1 million worth of grant money, hosted absolutely every course he could in exchange for free spots on the course for his people. And his people had brand new equipment and got an average of 100 hours of high quality training every year. Is that something that we don't maximize enough, is the hosting and reaching out, or maybe hosting as a region to share the costs, or to reach out to people and say, hey, Kevin, we'd love to have you in. Money's tight for us. So if we host you and get the word out and fill the seats, how many comp spots do we get? Do we need to do a better job of maximizing that element?
Well, as you know, absolutely yes is the answer. But as you know, this can be a kind of a moneymaker for a training budget for that agency as well. I mean, most of your trainers say, okay, listen, if you host a spot, I'll comp you X amount of positions, or you can enter into a deal where as long as my minimum income is met, anything else you guys can sell. In other words, you can, if you want to handle the training, and that's kind of shifts the responsibility to the host agency to advertise and to generate interest, because they're going to benefit. I mean, I have no problem as long as my minimum amount is met for the agency to make a profit on the remainder. Now, my old agency, unfortunately, that money had to go back into the city's general fund, so it could not be used specifically for police training. But what a great thing if you can work out a deal with your city that there's an account that you can contribute to on hosting. Then you can send people. You can do both. You can host as well as send people out, because you're going to benefit.
Absolutely, and I think we just need to be a little more creative and as to how we do some of this. So what would be some of the other key elements around this topic of use of force that we need to be looking at, or some key training that we need to be delivering? Let's take a step back. Let's look at the officers, because I think a lot of times, we leave them out. We fail to give them an understanding of these things so that they can self-advocate, or that they can make sure they're looking after themselves. What would be some of the things that we would need to train officers on a continual basis so that they have a deep understanding of some of these factors?
Well, what you said is so absolutely true, in that what an officer oftentimes, all he or she has to rely upon is the policy and procedure. And so they get involved in an officer-involved shooting, and at their most vulnerable time, whether it's on scene or in the hours after or days after, or until the thing really, as I map this out, Brian, from the event until, let's say, the civil suit is over with, because these things, it seems like every bullet fired comes with an attorney attached to it, that there are so many different areas in which we have to train and have to be more diligent to educate our officers, whether it's on scene and here, hey, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be, first of all, everything from whether you're injured or not, do you have a body-worn camera? Do you give a public safety statement? Is a union rep or attorney going to represent you on the scene? When is your interview going to be conducted? Who's going to be present in your interview? Just on and on. All these things have to be dealt with and trained. If we're going to properly prepare the officer for the post-incident, process or the system that we have. And you take something like an interview. I mean, I dealt with a tragic case I mentioned before in Pennsylvania, in which a part-time officer who was a school resource officer was involved in a deadly shooting. And his agency had a policy and procedure, and it wasn't bad, to be perfectly honest, as policies and procedures go. And in it clearly said that the officer would not give a statement until an attorney was called and gave his phone number, and until that attorney was present, that officer would not give a statement. Well, that night the chief from that department called in the state police, said, "Hey, please take over this investigation," and they immediately took that officer to a barracks where, without legal representation, and nobody called that attorney that evening to represent the officer. So that officer gave a full interview, multi-hour interview, right after the incident with no attorney present. And most of us would say, wow, that, I didn't know that could happen nowadays. But policy can be worthless if it's not implemented. And their argument later on, this was an officer charged with murder that did essentially 4 years, was incarcerated in county jail for 4 years until he finally pled out to involuntary manslaughter with time served. But the funny thing, or the sad thing with that is, and it's something that we have to factor in, because there's so many part-time officers out there, and many, even mid-sized agencies, use part-timers. Well, these part-timers may not be represented by legal counsel because they're not members of the union. So who's going to represent them? Has that been worked out in advance? So there are so many things that my former union, or I'm still a member of the Fraternal Order of Police, but my local purchased legal insurance for every officer in the agency, because they realized that one massive civil suit or one massive criminal trial of an officer, even though the officer did nothing wrong, that could bankrupt the union. So, these things have to be thought about as well and trained to officers. And we don't tell officers walking in the door, hey, by the way, have you purchased secondary insurance to cover yourself on these things? Did you know this was available? And on and on and on. So yes, this should be part of it. Brian, what else is more important in law enforcement right now?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And like you say, I think we assume that people know these things, and yet a lot of times don't. So you talked about statements, and is part of this that a lot of officers don't really understand.
Cutting out a little bit, Brian.
Is part of this that officers don't really understand around statements? Like, what's the difference between a public safety statement and a statement that they're going to give to investigators? What is required of them as far as giving a statement to investigators? What is required? Is there different rules for witness officers than there is for involved officers? Do the rules apply? How does it apply to part-timers or to reserves? Is that part of this that we need to make sure that people understand all of these different elements, as opposed to just assuming that A, it'll never happen, or assuming B, well, they already must know that?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely true. The public safety statement came out of Los Angeles, LAPD, post Rodney King, as you well know, and it was the understanding that a police officer couldn't simply shut up and invoke their Fifth Amendment rights on scene. I was involved in an incident in which a part-time officer from a at least a rookie, it might have been just a rookie officer, it's been a number of years ago, was involved in a shooting, and he shot and wounded a fleeing B&E suspect. And as if that weren't bad enough, that the guy did not present a deadly threat at that time, one of the errant rounds went across the street, perforated the exterior wall of a house, and shot and killed a guy as he was sleeping on his sofa. So things like that is like, where were you standing? Where did you fire? Where is the evidence? All that. Those are public safety statements that you just can't shut up about. But even then, one would advocate that, because what tends to happen is that the officer did the right thing, and they want to make sure that everybody knows they did the right thing. Or they did the right thing, but they taint their statement by saying something like, I didn't mean to shoot. And that brings about, denial of some legal protections, because the truth of the matter is that an intentional act, it has different coverage than an accidental or unintentional or negligent act. So all these things, once again, to protect your legal rights throughout this process. But, even though we advocate, and one of our good friends, Laura Scarry, and I've talked about this at the conference before in a presentation we did about how consensual interviews are important. To give a consensual interview and not have a well-trained, well-experienced criminal defense attorney in the room with you protecting your rights is foolhardy. I went to a training program lately, and once again, I was, really shocked to hear the instructor say, he asked the question, should we just allow an officer involved in a shooting to give a statement? And my response was, not without representation, there. And he was like, no, that we should just let them if they want to. They want to tell it. They did the right thing. Let them tell. And that's, you're not in the right frame of mind to protect your rights and make a statement at the same time.
Now, there's a couple of issues there, and I know you mentioned Laura Scarry. I know a number of years ago, Laura and Tim Janowick, who are both ILEADA members, had put together a public safety statement format for investigators to train investigators, and Tim and they were sharing that information at the ILEADA conference, and people were starting to weave that into some of their scenarios where they would have the supervisor, after a scenario where an officer utilized deadly force, go through the public safety statement with the officer. So it seems to me that that's number one, is that we need to make sure that we understand what should be involved in a public safety statement, and then train both the officers and the supervisors. But is the other piece that we're missing, and especially with the prevalence of small agencies, is that people don't give any thought in advance to who should I call for competent legal representation. And so they just get the phone book out and call some lawyer who says what that trainer said. Well, just go ahead and give a statement if you didn't do anything wrong. Are those a couple of the elements of this training piece?
Oh, yeah. It's why it's so, for those agencies that are in right-to-work states, I feel for them. For instance, down at Atlanta, I've watched a couple different incidents happen. One was the use of non-deadly force with a tasering during the riots last year, and another one was, if you remember, the shooting death of a subject in a Wendy's parking lot who had assaulted police officers while he was resisting arrest, and took a taser and turned towards the officer. But in both those incidents, with multiple officers involved, those officers were denied due process and were terminated without following policy and procedures. So we go back. Here's a large agency that's got a lot of great guys on it and everything, but the politics of force were such that, the mayor of Atlanta pretty much said, "Hey, this is what we had to do to keep the riots down," and so they were sacrificing the officer at the altar of political pressure in the shooting, especially, and made that statement. A friend of mine, who's an excellent attorney, Lance LaRusso, was down in based in the Atlanta area, and he represents that police department quite a bit, and very experienced attorney, and very good with the procedures from the Atlanta Police Department. So yes, you want the proper representation depending on the circumstance. A criminal defense attorney may not be the attorney you want if you're facing a disciplinary hearing on a use of force. And likewise, that labor attorney that you use for arbitration hearings may not be the attorney you want rolling out in the middle of the night when there's been an officer-involved shooting. Once again, these systems have to be delineated, and that's why it's so important to be a member of a police union or association, if at all possible.
And you mentioned the insurance piece, and I know talking to an officer that, was arrested and charged within a few days of a shooting. Again, it was strictly political, but their life was turned upside down in a heartbeat. But one of the things that they told me is that one of the best pieces of advice they ever got was early in their career to make sure that you sign up for this insurance. Is that another piece of this that people need to be aware of, what insurance is out there, and take advantage of that early in their careers, just like all other insurance policies, so that when it does happen to us, and it may never, but when it does, we have some backup plan?
Oh, definitely. The Fraternal Order of Police just rolled out their legal protection that you can buy different plans, and they're great in terms of cost. Whether you want to be covered for criminal, you want to be covered for off-duty, you want to be covered for internal. I opted because my Fraternal Order of Police had good attorneys on retainer, and they would pick up the tab for internal. I opted out of that, but many officers chose to do that as well. I also had two different, let's say, if not insurance coverage for incidents off-duty that had nothing to do with my law enforcement. Now, I couldn't use that coverage if, for instance, I was robbed off duty and it never was under the color of law as a police officer. Then I could use that coverage. Likewise, if I'm not saying I'm a police officer, you're under arrest, or say the magic words and go from off duty to on duty, then my association, labor association, as well as my agency, is not going to cover me. So yeah, it's so important nowadays to think about those things and to have a strategy and to really educate yourself, because I'm working on multiple cases now. But once an officer is indicted, they frequently are their employment is terminated. They have no income or anything else. And the legal bills can be astronomical on these defense of officer-involved shootings or use of force incidents.
Now, speaking of investments, and that insurance is such a critical investment for people, it seems that we fail to also invest in our own training. And you mentioned this before. Is that a key especially for trainers, but for everybody in the profession, to set money aside, set aside $5 a day, or every time? I know a friend of mine, he and his wife, every time they get a $5 bill, they throw it in a jar, and that accumulates pretty quickly, and then they use it to go on holidays. But do we need to do that too, so that we can attend more training on our own, where budgets are so tight? Training is seen as an expense, and a lot of times we're only going to get the bare minimum training. Do we need, especially trainers, or they need to have a greater willingness to invest in themselves and invest in their own training and development?
Absolutely true, Brian. Even post retirement, I've been to 2 training programs where I took my time. I took my own time, had to, get a motel for the night before. They were one-day programs. So one-night motel stay, as well as drive several hours to the area in which the training was to be conducted. And, so I think that, even in retirement, yes, I'm in the business, and yes, it's continuing to build my knowledge base as well as my resume for my my business. But I can't tell you personally how training has saved my life, and the fact that training kept me motivated over the years, because we can get stale on the job, we can get burnt out. Go to a course, find something that, expand your knowledge base, go outside your comfort zone, and there's so many great trainers, friends of ours that are out there, as well as people in the business that are good, solid trainers that, is relatively low cost. One thing is for certain, you can't call a timeout in the middle of an event to say, you know what, I need to practice or I need more training. It doesn't work like that. So absolutely.
So one of the questions that I'm asking everybody in Season 4 is about resources that they would recommend. So while we're on this subject of people investing in themselves, in addition to going to the ILEADA conference where they get access to a tremendous number of training sessions and great trainers and great information, what would be some other resources that you would recommend to ILEADA members, especially ones that are involved in, say, use of force training? What are some training programs or resources that you would recommend that they'd be willing to invest in that would help to develop their skills and knowledge?
Well, I think we are at a time in law enforcement training when the resources have never been greater. Whether it's a quality book, and most of these books are available for literally pennies on a Kindle or some type of download. Whether it's some of the great podcasts that are out there that are motivational and deal with so many different topics. I mean, I frequently download podcasts onto Jump Drive, and I'm able to listen to these things in my car as I'm driving. And when I was working back and forth, it would just pop something in, and there was things that you've done and are available. And both of us are blogging now. I mean, you're more productive than I am, although I'm more wordy, I would say, Brian. But there's great blogs out there that talk about these things. So I was just approached a couple weeks ago. I'll be teaching Adam Kanakin, who you know from Canada, and actually came to ILEADA this year and did a ton of different interviews. Has some great stuff with ILET, his organization, and I'll be teaching at his online conference, which is coming up at the end of July, and that's relatively inexpensive. So it's not just, listen, I understand that we have a lot of young people that have kids and children and family commitments, that can't go out of town for several days, and even financial. But there are a ton of things, whether it's getting involved or looking on YouTube, whether it's listening to a podcast or reading a blog or whatever. Once again, you're investing in yourself, and if your family is important, then coming home to your family is vital. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that you're the best decision maker you can be. And that involves so many different facets. You can be a great shooter, but if you don't know use of force law, you're going to potentially make a bad decision in an actual incident. You could be a great, knowledgeable about the law and a good shooter, but if you don't know what happens after an incident, you can say something or do something that forever changes your life and the life of your family. So there's so many opportunities out there. It's not just certainly it's understanding the importance of training and setting money aside every year for professional development. My wife's a physical therapist, and every year as part of her continuing ed, she has to attend training, and she's been doing it as long as I've been in law enforcement. So we both understand. And then, what's amazing, Brian, is you go to a course, whether it's online or in person, and you come back and say, man, I heard something today that was great. Let me share this with you. And then go back and tell your partners if you're working patrol, or tell your shift mates and share it with people.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to put in a plug for your book, Use of Force Investigations, a Manual for Law Enforcement. Are there a couple of other books that pop to mind right away for you? And what would be one or two of your favorite podcasts?
Wow, there's so many podcasts that I listen to that from Joe Rogan and even some of his stuff that you wouldn't think would be beneficial to law enforcement, but also, Jordan Peterson, who talks about life and, so many different issues, the holistic thing. I mean, I talk about Darrell Ross's book, and Darrell Ross is a good friend. As a matter of fact, I've got it sitting nearby, and that's Guidelines for Investigating Officer-Involved Shootings, Arrest-Related Deaths, and Deaths in Custody. And you could even read some things that a book you may not agree with. I'm not a fan of somebody that's involved in law enforcement right now by the name of a law professor in South Carolina. His name is Seth Stoughton, and his book, Evaluating Police Uses of Force, I don't agree with, but sometimes you have to expand your knowledge base of things. I mean, if all you do is seek out those people that agree with you, you don't have a well-rounded education.
Excellent. Great recommendations. And like you say, there's so many books, and people can go back and listen to the recent interview with Darrell Ross, where he talks about some of the critical issues. So, Kevin, I want to thank you for making the time. Now, what's the best way for people to reach out to you, follow up with you about training, or maybe engage you to come in and teach some of the courses that you offer, or engage you as an expert witness, or just connect with you to follow up to have discussions about building a system in their organization? So what's the best way for people to find out more about everything that you offer and connect with you?
Well, I do have a website, which is kd-forcetraining.com. That's kd-forcetraining.com. And the best way to get a hold of me is through email, which is trainer Kevin Davis, no hyphens or periods. That's trainer Kevin Davis @gmail.com, and email is probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Excellent. So for those of us from our generation that may be thinking KD stands for Kraft Dinner, it actually stands for Kevin Davis. So,
I'm not very imaginative. I've been called that since I was a kid, so as you well know.
Those things stick, and I would highly recommend that people get your book and spend some time on your website and look at going to classes or reaching out to you to bring you in to deliver training. So, Kevin, I want to thank you for making time for the interview, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your 4 decades of service as a law enforcement professional, all the things that you've done to enhance our profession, enhance our knowledge and understanding of these critical issues, and all the things that you continue to do to help to improve the profession and raise the bar for all of us. So for everything that you have done, everything you continue to do, thank you so much for your commitment and your contributions.
Thank you, Brian. And once again, those of us that were in law enforcement are now retired, especially in the training business. Our hearts are still with those brave men and women who are form the thin blue line, and we still try to make a difference.
Excellent, and you are making a difference, and it's much appreciated. And so I also want to thank the listeners. I want to thank you for being an ILEADA member and for being a trainer. As a trainer, you are in one of the most influential leadership positions in this profession, and being a good trainer is a lot of work, and I thank you for making that commitment. I encourage you to let the information that Kevin shared with you in this interview simmer, percolate overnight, and be intentional about sitting down tomorrow, taking at least 10 minutes and writing out what I learned from that interview with Kevin, and then take time to write out your action steps. What actions are you going to take to implement what you learned and to share what you learned? Thank you for taking the time to listen to this interview. I trust that you found value in the information shared during the interview. To join a community of thousands of trainers who are committed to advancing law enforcement training and get full access to all the benefits of being an ILEADA member, go to ileeta.org, that's ILEETA.org, and click on the members link, then on the membership application. If you have 3 or more trainers in your training cadre, then please consider contacting our Director of Operations, Jenny Merlin, at jmerlin, that's JMERLIN, at ileeta.org for information on bundle memberships.